For a long moment, John stood in silence, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. Finally, he nodded, the smallest sign of acceptance. "I'll go see him," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The following day, Michael drove John to the vet clinic to see Max. The ride was quiet, but the tension that had been building for weeks seemed to ease slightly with every passing mile. When they arrived at the clinic, John hesitated at the door, his hands trembling as he reached for the handle. Michael noticed the hesitation and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, John. Max needs to see you." John swallowed hard and nodded before pushing the door open. Inside the clinic, Dr. Sarah Collins greeted them with a warm smile. "Mr. Everett, it's good to see you. Max has been asking about you." John's lips twitched into a brief, sad smile. "I doubt that." Dr. Collins led them to the back room where Max was resting. The old dog was lying on a blanket, his body thinner than John remembered, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw his owner. His tail gave a weak wag, and he let out a soft whine of recognition. John's breath caught in his throat as he knelt down beside Max, gently stroking the dog's head. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I haven't been around. I've missed you." Max nuzzled his hand, his tail wagging a little more vigorously now, as if forgiving John for his absence. Michael watched the reunion from the doorway, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and sadness. This moment was important, not just for Max, but for John. It was a step forward, a small crack in the wall that John had built around himself. But even as Max began to recover, John's internal struggle continued. Over the next few weeks, John visited Max regularly, but the weight of his own guilt and shame still hung over him like a dark cloud. He refused to accept further help from Michael or anyone else, despite their offers. He isolated himself more and more, convinced that he didn't deserve the kindness that others were showing him. One evening, after visiting Max, John sat in his living room, staring at the photograph of Clara on the side table. His mind raced with memories of their life together, of the war, of all the moments when he had felt like he had failed the people he loved. The shame was suffocating. He had lived his life as a soldier, as a protector, but now he couldn't even take care of his own dog. And Clara, he had been helpless when she got sick. She had been the love of his life, and he hadn't been able to save her. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at her photo. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Michael, sensing that John was spiraling, continued to reach out, but John's responses became fewer and more distant. The cold winter days dragged on, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing John, losing him to his own demons, to the weight of his past. One night after his shift, Michael decided to drive by John's house again. As he approached, he saw that the porch light was off, and the house was dark. Something in his gut told him that something was wrong. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After several more knocks, his concern grew. Finally, he tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Stepping inside, Michael was hit by the overwhelming cold. The space heater was off, and the blankets that had been draped over the windows were gone. The house was eerily silent. "John?" Michael called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. He made his way through the cluttered living room and down the hallway to the bedroom. There, lying on the bed, was John, his face pale and gaunt. His breathing was shallow and his skin was cold to the touch. "John!" Michael rushed to his side, shaking him gently. "John, wake up!" John's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused. "Michael?" he rasped, his voice weak. "Hang on, John. I'm getting you to a hospital," Michael said urgently, pulling out his phone to call for an ambulance. John weakly grabbed Michael's arm, his grip feeble. "I'm tired," he whispered. "I'm so tired." "Don't you dare give up now," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone, John. You hear me? You're not alone." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and John was rushed to the hospital. Michael stayed by his side the entire time, refusing to leave. The doctors stabilized John, but they told Michael that it had been a close call. The cold, combined with John's deteriorating health, had nearly killed him. As John lay in the hospital bed, his body frail and weak, Michael sat beside him, his heart heavy. He had known that John was struggling, But he hadn't realized just how deep the pain ran. He hadn't realized that John had been on the brink of giving up. "You don't get to check out that easy, old man," Michael muttered softly, more to himself than to John. For the first time in weeks, John's eyes met Michael's, and there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, or perhaps the smallest spark of understanding. "I'm sorry," John whispered, his voice barely audible. Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and compassion. "Don't be sorry, John. Just promise me you won't give up. Not yet." John didn't respond, but the tears in his eyes said enough. The sterile white walls of the hospital room were quiet and still, broken only by the soft beeping of machines monitoring John Everett's vital signs. He lay in the bed, his frail body hooked up to IVs and monitors. Despite the warmth of the room, John still felt a chill deep in his bones, as if the cold that had nearly claimed his life still lingered inside him. Officer Michael Carter sat beside the bed, his expression somber but filled with a quiet determination. It had been a close call, too close. John had come within inches of giving up, and if Michael hadn't followed his gut and checked on him that night, the outcome could have been far worse. John stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. The exhaustion was clear in his face, but there was something else too, something that hadn't been there before. He looked over at Michael, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You didn't have to stay." Michael leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "I'm not going anywhere, John. You've been through hell and back, but you're not doing it alone anymore." For a long moment, John said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window where the pale winter sun filtered in through the blinds. His pride, which had once kept him isolated and resistant to help, seemed to have crumbled in the face of reality. He had come so close to losing everything: Max, his health, his life. "I don't know how to ask for help," John admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long trying to do it all on my own. I don't know how to do anything else." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He had seen it before in men like John, men who had spent their lives taking care of others, fighting battles and carrying the burdens of the world on their shoulders, only to find themselves lost when the fight was over. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," Michael said gently. "There are people who care about you, people who want to help. It's not weakness to let them in." John's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight of the world by himself. The sterile white walls of the hospital room were quiet and still, broken only by the soft beeping of machines monitoring John Everett's vital signs. He lay in the bed, his frail body hooked up to IVs and monitors. Despite the warmth of the room, John still felt a chill deep in his bones, as if the cold that had nearly claimed his life still lingered inside him. Officer Michael Carter sat beside the bed, his expression somber but filled with a quiet determination. It had been a close call, too close. John had come within inches of giving up, and if Michael hadn't followed his gut and checked on him that night, the outcome could have been far worse. John stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. The exhaustion was clear in his face, but there was something else too, something that hadn't been there before. He looked over at Michael, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You didn't have to stay." Michael leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "I'm not going anywhere, John. You've been through hell and back, but you're not doing it alone anymore." For a long moment, John said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window where the pale winter sun filtered in through the blinds. His pride, which had once kept him isolated and resistant to help, seemed to have crumbled in the face of reality. He had come so close to losing everything: Max, his health, his life. "I don't know how to ask for help," John admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long trying to do it all on my own. I don't know how to do anything else." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He had seen it before in men like John, men who had spent their lives taking care of others, fighting battles, and carrying the burdens of the world on their shoulders, only to find themselves lost when the fight was over. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," Michael said gently. "There are people who care about you, people who want to help. It's not weakness to let them in." John's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight of the world by himself. Over the next few days, things began to change. John's recovery was slow but steady, and Michael was there every step of the way. He visited the hospital daily, checking in on John, bringing updates from Max, and helping him navigate the endless paperwork from social services and the VA. John resisted at first, still uncomfortable with the idea of accepting help, but each day he grew a little more open to it. Officer Lisa Matthews also stopped by, offering quiet support and bringing along brochures for local veterans support groups. "These guys have been through the same things you have," she explained. "They understand what it's like. You don't have to explain yourself to them. They just get it." John glanced at the brochures, unsure if he was ready to take that step. But the idea of talking to other veterans, people who might understand the burden he carried, planted a seed of possibility in his mind. A few weeks later, John was discharged from the hospital. The doctors had been clear that he couldn't go back to living in the same conditions he had been in before. His house was unsafe, his health too fragile to endure another cold winter without proper care. Michael and Lisa had already put the wheels in motion, reaching out to local resources and support networks to help John get back on his feet. As they drove John home from the hospital, Michael glanced over at him, sensing the anxiety that clung to the old man like a shadow. "You're not going back to that house alone," Michael said firmly. "We've arranged for some help." John's brow furrowed, the familiar tension rising in his chest. "I don't need a caretaker, Michael. I'm not some helpless old man." "You're not helpless," Michael replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But you don't have to do everything on your own. We've got people who want to help make your home safe again, and they're not asking for anything in return." John's hands trembled slightly in his lap. "And what about Max?" Michael smiled softly. "Max is ready to come home. Dr. Collins said he's made a full recovery, and she'll be bringing him over this afternoon." John's heart swelled with a mix of relief and emotion. He had come so close to losing Max, and the thought of being reunited with his faithful companion gave him something to hold on to, a reason to keep fighting. When they arrived at John's house, he was greeted with a sight that took his breath away. The overgrown yard had been cleared, and a group of volunteers were already hard at work repairing the broken windows, fixing the sagging porch, and shoveling snow from the walkway. Among the volunteers were local veterans, neighbors, and even a few of Michael's colleagues from the police department. John stood frozen on the sidewalk, his eyes wide with disbelief. What is all this?" Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This is your community, John. These are people who care about you." John's voice trembled as he spoke, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't deserve this." Michael shook his head. "Everyone deserves a second chance. You've given so much, John. It's time for someone to give back to you." As they made their way toward the house, several of the volunteers stopped to greet John, shaking his hand and offering words of encouragement. Some of them were veterans like John, men who had fought in different wars but shared the same scars. Others were neighbors who had seen John's struggles from afar but hadn't known how to help, until now. Later that afternoon, as the repairs continued, Dr. Collins arrived with Max. The old dog's tail wagged furiously as he bounded out of the car, his energy renewed after weeks of care. John knelt down, wrapping his arms around Max, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, boy." Max licked John's face, his tail still wagging, as if to say that all was forgiven. Michael watched the reunion from the porch, his heart swelling with pride. This was what it was all about, helping people, giving them hope when they had none. He knew that John's journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, John had a community behind him. He wasn't alone anymore. As the weeks went by, John's house was transformed. Volunteers came by regularly to help with repairs. Neighbors dropped off meals, and a local veteran support group reached out to offer assistance with accessing John's VA benefits. Slowly but surely, John began to rebuild his life, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his past still pressed down on him, when the memories of Clara and the war threatened to pull him under. But each time those dark thoughts crept in, John reminded himself that he wasn't alone. He had Max, he had Michael, and he had a community that cared about him. One evening, as the sun set over Richmond Hills, John sat on his newly repaired porch, Max curled up at his feet. The cold winter air had given way to the first hints of spring, and the world felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. Michael joined him on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. John took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs. "Better," he admitted. "Still got a long way to go, but better." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That's all anyone can ask for. For the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to smile. A real, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." "You don't need to thank me," Michael replied, his voice warm. "This is what community is all about, taking care of each other." Spring arrived in Richmond Hills, the snow melting away to reveal budding flowers and fresh greenery. The air was crisp and filled with the promise of new beginnings. John Everett sat on his newly repaired porch, watching as Max chased a ball around the yard with renewed energy. For the first time in what felt like years, John allowed himself to enjoy the moment. His house was no longer a crumbling relic. It had been transformed into a home again, thanks to the generosity of his neighbors, fellow veterans, and Officer Michael Carter. John's health had improved as well. He'd been going to regular checkups, eating proper meals, and even began taking daily walks with Max. The stubborn pride that had once kept him isolated had softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the fact that sometimes it was okay to lean on others. But even as the days grew warmer and the light returned to his life, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had his house, his dog, and his health, but the emotional scars from the past were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He had survived, yes, but survival wasn't the same as healing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael came by for a visit. The two men sat on the porch, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Their friendship had grown over the months, and Michael had become a regular presence in John's life, offering support without judgment. "Have you thought about going to one of the veterans support group meetings?" Michael asked, his voice casual but with a hint of suggestion. John hesitated, swirling the coffee in his mug. He had avoided the question for weeks now, despite Lisa's suggestion and Michael's gentle nudges. The idea of sitting in a room with other veterans, talking about the things he had buried for so long, felt overwhelming. "I don't know," John admitted, his voice quiet. "I'm not much for talking about the past." Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Just being around other guys who've been through the same things can make a difference." John sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's just, I've spent so long keeping it all to myself. I wouldn't even know where to start." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "You start by showing up. That's all. The rest will come when you're ready." For a long time they sat in silence, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. John stared out at the yard, watching Max chase fireflies in the fading light. He knew Michael was right, but the fear of reopening old wounds kept him from making the decision. But then he thought about Clara, about the promise he had made to her before she passed. She had always been the one to remind him that he didn't have to carry everything alone, that there was strength in vulnerability. Maybe it was time to finally listen. "All right," John said finally, his voice soft but determined. "I'll go." Michael smiled, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "You won't regret it." The next week, John attended his first Veterans Support Group meeting. It was held at the local community center, a small, unassuming building that had become a gathering place for veterans from all walks of life. John arrived early, feeling a knot of anxiety in his chest as he stood outside the door, unsure if he was ready for what lay inside. He was greeted by Greg Miller, a fellow Vietnam veteran and one of the group's leaders. Greg was a burly man with a thick beard and a warm, welcoming presence that immediately put John at ease. "John Everett, right?" Greg asked, extending a hand. "I've heard about you from Michael. Glad you decided to come." As they sat in comfortable silence, Watching the sun dip below the horizon, John felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He wasn't alone anymore. John shook his hand, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Thanks. It's, a little overwhelming. Greg chuckled. That's how it feels for everyone the first time. But don't worry, you're in good company here. As John stepped inside, he was struck by the familiarity of the faces around him. Some were older like him, with the same lines of experience etched into their features. Others were younger, men and women who had served in more recent conflicts, but all of them carried the same invisible weight, the burden of memories, of loss, of survival. The meeting began with introductions, and as the veterans around the room shared their stories, John listened in silence. Some spoke of the war, of the things they had seen and done that still haunted them. Others talked about the struggles they faced after returning home. Homelessness, addiction, isolation. Every word felt like a mirror, reflecting pieces of John's own life back at him. When it was John's turn to speak, he hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he considered leaving. But then he looked around the room and saw the understanding in the eyes of the men and women who were listening. They weren't judging him. They weren't expecting him to be anything other than what he was, a survivor just like them. I've never really talked about it, John began, his voice shaky. The war, I mean. I've spent most of my life just trying to keep it buried. But lately, I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop carrying it all by myself. He paused, glancing around the room before continuing. I lost a lot over the years. Friends, family, my wife, Clara, and I thought that if I just kept it all to myself, I could protect the people I had left. But it didn't work. I ended up alone anyway. There was a murmur of understanding from the group, and John felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest. For the first time in years, he was allowing himself to feel the weight of everything he had held inside. I'm not sure what to do next, John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm here, and I guess that's a start. Greg nodded, his expression gentle. That's more than a start, John. That's everything. Over the next few months, John became a regular at the support group meetings. Each time he attended, he opened up a little more, sharing pieces of his past that he had kept locked away for decades. The burden that had once felt so heavy began to lighten, and for the first time, John felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't alone anymore. Max, too, seemed to sense the change in John. The old dog's energy had returned, and the two of them began spending more time outdoors, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, walks in the park, afternoons on the porch, and quiet evenings spent watching the sunset. But even as things improved, John knew that the hardest part was still ahead. He had made progress, yes, but there was one final piece of the puzzle that he had yet to face: the loss of Clara. One warm summer evening, as John sat on the porch with Michael, he finally opened up about his wife. The two men had shared countless conversations over the months, but this was the one topic John had always avoided. Clara was everything to me, John began, his voice quiet but steady. We met just before I shipped off to Vietnam. She was my light, you know? The one thing that kept me going when everything else fell apart. Michael listened in silence, sensing the depth of emotion behind John's words. When I got back, we built a life together, John continued. She was always the strong one, always reminding me that I didn't have to carry everything on my own. But then she got sick, and there was nothing I could do to save her. I've never felt more helpless in my life. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. I've been angry at myself for so long, angry that I couldn't save her, that I couldn't be strong enough. And after she died, I just shut down. I stopped caring about everything. Max was the only thing that kept me going. Michael placed a hand on John's shoulder, his voice soft. You didn't fail her, John. You loved her, and you did everything you could. Sometimes things are out of our control, no matter how much we want to fix them. John's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve openly. He wept for Clara, for the years they had lost, and for the life they had built together. It was a release that had been building for a long time. And as the tears fell, John felt the weight of his grief lift, just a little. Michael sat beside him in silence, offering quiet support, knowing that this moment was about more than words. It was about healing, about letting go of the guilt and shame that had held John captive for so long. In the weeks that followed, John began to find peace. He still attended the Veterans Support Group, and he still had difficult days, but the shadows that had once haunted him were no longer as dark. He had found a way to live again, not just survive, and he was grateful for the community that had helped him get there. Max remained his loyal companion, a reminder of the love and loyalty that had carried John through the hardest times. And Michael, now more than just a police officer, had become a true friend, someone who had stood by John when he needed it most. As summer turned to fall, John stood on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world felt quieter now, more peaceful, and for the first time in years, John allowed himself to look forward to the future. "I'm going to be all right," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I'm going to be all right." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The crisp autumn air rustled through the trees as John Everett took his usual morning walk with Max. The two of them moved at a slow but steady pace, Max sniffing at the fallen leaves while John kept his hands tucked in the pockets of his coat. The days had grown shorter, and the cool bite in the air signaled the approach of winter. But this time, John wasn't worried. His home was warm, his life more stable, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The last few months had been transformative for John. The burden he had carried for so long, the guilt, the shame, the isolation, had slowly begun to lift. His regular attendance at the Veterans Support Group had given him a sense of community he hadn't realized he needed, and his friendship with Officer Michael Carter had grown into something more than just a helping hand. Michael had become a trusted friend, someone John could lean on without feeling like a burden. As John walked back toward his house, Max trotting happily beside him, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The house, once falling apart, now stood proudly, with freshly painted walls, repaired windows, and a welcoming front porch. The volunteers who had helped rebuild it had become like family, and John had even found himself helping out with some of the work, rediscovering his own sense of purpose in the process. Later that afternoon, Michael stopped by for one of their regular coffee visits. The two men sat on the porch, the warm mugs in their hands a welcome comfort against the cool breeze. Max lay at John's feet, his tail thumping contentedly as he dozed in the fading sunlight. "How's everything going with the support group?" Michael asked, his voice casual, but filled with genuine curiosity. John smiled, a real contented smile. "It's good. Better than I thought it would be. I was hesitant at first, but I'm glad I went." Michael nodded, a look of satisfaction in his eyes. "I knew you'd find your place there. It's not easy to open up, but once you do, it makes all the difference." John took a sip of his coffee, his mind drifting back to the meetings he'd attended. Each one had brought him closer to healing, to letting go of the past in a way that felt right. He had learned to talk about Clara, about the war, and about the pain he had carried for so long. And in return, he had found understanding, not pity, something he had feared but no longer felt. "There's one thing I've been thinking about," John said, his voice quieter now. "I've been thinking of speaking at the next meeting. About Clara. I've shared bits and pieces, but I think I'm ready to talk about everything." Michael looked over at him, his expression serious but encouraging. "That's a big step, John. Are you sure you're ready?" John nodded, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I think it's time. I've been holding on to it for too long, and I owe it to her, to both of us, to let it go." Michael smiled softly. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of you." John didn't say anything, but the warmth that filled his chest was enough. He had never expected to feel pride again, not after everything he had been through. But here he was, on the other side of a long, difficult journey, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had something to be proud of. The next Veterans Support Group meeting was held in the same community center where John had first walked through the doors, unsure of what to expect. But this time, as he entered the room, He felt a sense of belonging. The faces that once felt unfamiliar now felt like family. People who had shared their stories with him and who had listened to his in return. As the meeting began, Greg, the group's leader, introduced John. Today we have a special speaker. John Everett has been with us for a while now, and he's decided to share his story with us. John, whenever you're ready,